Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Chang. On February 12th, North Korea conducted a nuclear test. It was its third nuclear test and the first one since 2009. Should we be worried about North Korea's nuclear ambitions? And how does China, North Korea's main ally, fit into the picture? Here today to talk about this, we have Chang, the author of The Coming Collapse of China and Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Gordon, thanks for coming today.
Thank you.
So should we be worried about North Korea's nuclear test?
I think we should be worried because North Korea crossed two very important technical thresholds in very short order. In December, they had the launch of the three-stage missile, and then, of course, in February, the nuclear detonation that you talked about. So within 5 years, maybe 3, North Korea will be able to land a warhead anywhere on Earth, which means that they will hold the world to ransom. So yes, we should be worried about it because now it's really just a matter of time before they can threaten all of us. It's not a matter of science anymore, it's just really just engineering.
So do you think that North Korea will actually, you're saying 3 to 5 years before they develop the technological capability to hit anywhere in the world. So do you think they would actually bomb somewhere like the US?
I don't think so, but you never know. You got to remember, North Korea is not a status quo power like the Soviet Union was during the later stages of the Cold War. They have used violence to upset situations that they found to be unacceptable. They're certainly going to threaten. And when they threaten, you never know what's going to happen after that. But clearly, if they were to launch against the United States, we would obliterate them. But, you know, there are other things that they could do. They could launch against countries in the region which are not protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella. They could launch against Japan, maybe thinking that we wouldn't defend Japan, because if they thought, for instance, that China would come in, we might be intimidated. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong now that they have, or as when they get the ability to put nuclear warheads on missiles.
So are we looking at more tests, do you think, coming up? What's the significance of this compared to the 2009, 2006 tests?
North Korea has told us that there are going to be more of these events in a very short order. I mean, they could, they could decide not to go forward, but they've told us that they will. They're pretty good at doing what they say they'll do. So most people expect that there's going to be another nuclear detonation and another missile launch pretty soon, probably sometime this year.
Well, that's a lot sooner than if you look at the lag between the first two.
Right. I mean, it was 2006, 2009, and now 2013. There was a big interval there. But now that they've gotten sort of where they've got most of the technology in place. This last one, we don't know too much about the detonation, but it was more powerful than the one in 2009. And if this were a miniaturized weapon, that would really be much more impressive. So they are crossing those technological thresholds pretty quickly.
Well, let's talk about China's reaction to this. They, sent out a statement saying they weren't happy with it. But do you think that this nuclear test will change the relationship with China?
Well, China said, for instance, it's not going to support new sanctions at the UN Security Council. They've said they're not going to cut off aid. I don't think that there's going to be any fundamental change in the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang. I think the Chinese are a little bit pissed that the North Koreans did this without giving them enough notice. But also, this serves China's interest because every time this happens, countries in the region, the United States, we go to Beijing, ask for Chinese help, and they extract concessions from us. So, short term, Chinese leaders just love this dynamic. Long term, of course, it's not in China's long-term interest. And I think most policymakers in Beijing know that. But unfortunately, there's no consensus in the Chinese capital to change long-held pro-Pyongyang policies. And so we get all of these types of, all of these provocations from North Korea, and China doesn't do anything to stop them.
So you think this nuclear test, is it going to change our relationship, like the U.S.'s relationship with China? Are we going to go back again to, like you said, ask them to help out on the North Korea issue?
I hope not. I'm sure that we're going to do that, though, because the reaction of the administration will be to go to the Security Council to get new set of sanctions. To do that, you've got to run by both Russia and China. They've got vetoes, and so we're going to need their help. We either need their help to vote in favor of those sanctions or to not veto them, just sort of sit on their hands. But one way or another, we're going to be talking to the Chinese intensively about this. So I don't think that dynamic's going to change. The one thing that's really interesting, though, is that China is acting up on all sorts of fronts. The cyber hacking, going after Japan, trying to take those islands, trying to these territorial incursions into Indian-controlled territory. China is really taking on everybody at the same time. So, maybe the United States will back off a little bit this time because we realize that China isn't our friend. But clearly, we are seeing a very new Chinese assertiveness, which no one in the region likes.
So do you think that will kind of translate into China's relationship with North Korea? One thing I'm always kind of wondering is, what is China's real relationship with North Korea? Are they as staunch of an ally as they kind of seem to be? Or do they have any control over what North Korea does?
Well, China supplies 90% of North Korea's oil, 80% of consumer goods, 45% of the food, most of it on concessionary terms. Beijing is really Pyongyang's only supporter in places like the Security Council. The Chinese may not like what the North Koreans do on a month-to-month basis, but if they really didn't like it, they would withdraw support, and they haven't done that. I think it's because the Chinese just don't ask the North Koreans not to do things. And so, when something is really important for Beijing, they will make sure they get their way. But Beijing doesn't see this really, at least in the short term, as hurting Chinese interests, so they just let it go.
So they're not really that upset about the nuclear testing?
They're not really that upset. But this is really stupid policy on the part of Beijing because, after all, for more than 600 years, the Koreans and the Chinese have been at each other's throats. The North Koreans can point those missiles toward Beijing as well as Washington. The Chinese know this. And yet they don't stop it because of the short-term advantages, because of lack of consensus to change policy. But long-term, I think most Chinese policymakers just really think that this is not very good for China.
Let me ask, why do you think China is supporting North Korea? Is it just because the U.S. will go to them for concessions? Is it in China's interests to have North Korea kind of as a rogue state?
Well, right now in Beijing, we have this political transition. We have a new leader, Xi Jinping, who's very much of a nationalist. And I think that anything that seems in the short term to bedevil Washington is something that he's in favor of. I think it's sort of like, it's going to hurt America, so therefore I'm going to support it. And I don't know if it's any more complicated than that. Also, you got a Chinese military that has traditionally had very strong links with the North Korean military. And so and the military is so much more powerful in China these days. So the generals and the admirals are driving policy, and they're not going to permit Xi Jinping to sort of pull back. And I don't even think Xi Jinping wants to pull back. You see him really taking these very corrosive, very aggressive positions against Japan. So this sort of fits in with the way that he views it. This is China standing up. This is China sort of dominating the region, which is what he thinks really should be going on. So you got a very bad situation where you have both civilians and the military in China have these very nationalistic, militant policies.
Let me ask, because you mentioned Xi Jinping as a new leader in China, a lot of the countries involved in the North Korean issue have basically changed leadership recently. With Japan, South Korea is about to swear in a new president. Do you think that's going to change the dynamic at all? Even the U.S., we're going to have Secretary of State John Kerry instead of Hillary Clinton. Is this going to change how we work around this issue?
I think that the change, for instance, from Secretary Clinton to Secretary Kerry will change things, but only a little bit. Kerry would like to talk to the Chinese to try to develop this cooperative relationship. I think Secretary Clinton, when she stepped down, knew that it wasn't going to work because she came in with exactly the same attitude that Kerry had. And basically, the Chinese just made it very difficult for her to cooperate with them. Kerry's going to try to cooperate with Beijing. Beijing will not cooperate with Kerry. But, fundamentally, I don't think the dynamic changes that much because there are some pretty basic policies in place. Those policies aren't going to change. There will be some implementation differences, but I don't think they're going to be major.
So what do you think the U.S. should be doing in terms of the North Korea issue?
Well, first of all, I don't mind our going to the Security Council to try to get sanctions, but that shouldn't be the only thing that we should be doing. The first thing that we should be doing is putting in place the 2005 sanctions that the Bush administration against the Banco Delta Asia, Macau's bank. We should be putting in place those sanctions because we cut North Korea off from the global financial system. So the North Koreans, when they wanted to move money, had to give it to their diplomats. They put cash in suitcases, gave it to their diplomats who acted as mules. That really hurt North Korea. We need to do that again. And so I think that's very important. And the other thing that we need to do is make sure the North Koreans don't sell their new nuclear device to the Iranians. The Iranians were reported to be on site for the nuclear test. And I'm sure that this partnership between Iran and North Korea endures, because the Iranians were there in 2006 and 2009 as well. The Iranians have been in North Korea for all the ballistic missile tests that we know of. So essentially, we've got to stop them from selling this, which means we probably need to put our Navy off North Korea's shores. And we got to make it clear to the Chinese that if they permit the North Koreans to use Chinese airspace to sell stuff to Iran, that we will sanction China.
So what about, you said put the Navy at North Korea's shores. Is that going to escalate the tensions that already exist in the region?
Yes, it will, but we really don't have any choice. We've been backed into a corner right now because we cannot permit the Iranians to have a nuclear device and three-stage missiles, just like the North Koreans. So yes, there are no good solutions. Every solution is going to be a bad one. If we don't do anything, the Iranians will have a very destructive arsenal, and then only bad things will occur. So yes, there will be a downside to, we will increase tensions by doing these things, but we've got to the point where we have no choice.
Would it be worth risking a war in the Asia-Pacific region?
I don't think we're going to risk a war if we show the North Koreans and the Chinese that we mean business. You only back yourself into wars by having irresolute policies. And both the Bush policies and the Obama policies on North Korea have really been quite weak. That means that both the Iranians and the North Koreans have seen a big green light to pursue their very destructive ambitions. That, I think, is much more corrosive than having a strong policy. Because if we had a strong policy, we could put this problem back into the box.
All right, Gordon, thank you for joining us today to talk about this issue. And thanks for watching. For more on this and other issues on China, join us at ntd.tv.